Claire Thompson never imagined her family could still surprise her. An only child, raised by reserved parents, and a loving grandmother. She had always heard her grandmother's stories of a European youth told like faint, melancholy tales. "The past is where it belongs," Eleanor used to say, with a half smile and a trace of an accent that time never quite erased. Now, at 32 and deep into her doctoral research on World War II, Claire found herself on a very different path. One that would force her to confront that carefully guarded past, not by choice but by necessity. Her PhD was ambitious, investigating the roles of women in Nazi propaganda networks. Thanks to a fellowship from Columbia University, she traveled to Berlin to study rare and classified documents in a military archive that promised insights no textbook could provide. In her first week, she combed through reports, manifestos, faded pamphlets, and sepia-toned photographs of people whose names had long been forgotten. It all felt distant, like watching shadows behind glass, until she found that photo. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, impeccable uniform, sharp posture, cold eyes. But what chilled Claire wasn't the setting, nor the symbols in the background. It was the face. She knew that face, or she thought she did. Her fingers hovered over the photo as if touching it might erase the resemblance. She told herself the logical things, coincidence, a common face, a random woman from history. But the unease stayed. The following days became a blur of return visits, late-night searches, and growing obsession. She searched for the name listed beneath the photo, Anna Weissmann, Berlin, 1943, involved in propaganda. Disappeared in 1945, Claire began to lose sleep. Strange childhood memories floated back, Eleanor's ring, her accent, the vague stories with missing pieces. And that old jewelry box Claire was never allowed to touch. Maybe this wasn't a coincidence. Maybe it was a secret buried beneath decades of silence, a new country, a new name, and a rewritten life. And now, standing closer to the truth than she ever expected, Claire knew her research was no longer just academic. It was personal, too personal. The Federal Archive in Berlin was as quiet as a cathedral. Metal shelves stretched like corridors of a maze, and the scent of old paper clung to the brick walls. Claire moved through the labeled boxes, hearing nothing but the echo of her own footsteps and the faint hum of the ventilation system. She had requested access to what the archivists referred to as the Weissmann section, a collection of documents cataloguing women linked to Nazi propaganda operations. The box she received had no label, just a brown seal and a vague sense of weight. Inside, she found typed reports, address lists, red-stamped memos, and a series of black and white photographs clipped together. And there she was, again. The woman in the photograph, this time seated in an office with a swastika insignia faintly visible on the wall behind her. The handwritten caption read, "Anna Weissmann, Communications Division, 1943. Claire froze. The resemblance was haunting, the curve of the jaw, the arch of the brow, the way the woman's eyes narrowed toward the lens. The same jawline as her grandmother Eleanor, the same unknowable stare. She tried to brush it off. Flipped to the next report. Anna Weissmann, born in Königsberg, 1924, recruited at 18, fluent in French and English. Transferred to Berlin in 1942, disappeared after 1945, suspected escape through Austrian corridor. Claire's pen hovered over her notebook. The words blurred for a second, disappeared. Fluent in English. Escape route. Her grandmother had arrived in the United States in 1946, with few documents, with a European accent, and a past she never wanted to talk about. Claire's stomach turned. What once felt like cool academic detachment now felt personal, hot, tangled. Over the next few days, she cross-referenced names, combed through microfilm, scribbled in the margins of files. With each new discovery, pieces of Eleanor's life began to slip from their frame of innocence. Then she found it. A sealed cross-reference document labeled Candidate List, Identity Replacement, 1945. Among the entries, Anna Weissman, Eleanor Thompson, origin Southern Zone, status approved. Her fingers slipped off the pen. Thompson, the family name. Claire didn't need further confirmation. The woman in the photo wasn't just similar. She was Eleanor. The Weissman section had become an obsession. Claire spent entire days buried in folders, scanning reels of microfilm, cross-checking names with migration logs and coded memos. She wrote until her fingers cramped, sketched timelines, pinned dates. The lines on her notebook blurred into maps of someone else's life, someone who might have once been called Anna. One evening she found a report marked with a faded stamp. Protocol 031, absolute confidentiality required. The archivist assisting her said it was tied to post-war intelligence operations, likely related to Project Paperclip, the controversial American program that brought select German individuals to the US in exchange for cooperation. Claire's breath caught. Her grandmother never spoke of 1945, only said, "I left everything behind." Some things aren't meant to be revisited. The following morning, Claire began a new search, this time in the immigration records archived by the US Embassy files. It didn't take long. There it was, on the list from 1946, Eleanor Thompson. Nationality, Austrian, at point of entry, Ellis Island, traveling alone, declared profession secretary. But more curious was the notation on another list, one that tracked refugees by name and background. Anna Weissman, status missing, with a side note that someone had used the identity briefly, then vanished. 2 names, 2 roots, 1 face. Claire sat back, the room spinning slightly. She returned to her hotel in Kreuzberg that night and spread the documents across the small desk. The air felt too still. The lamp cast long shadows over the edges of the page. She stared at an old photograph of Eleanor, smiling in a park in New York around the 1960s. The face, softer now, aged by time, but undeniably the same. And in her notebook, Claire wrote a question she couldn't yet say aloud. If Eleanor was Anna, then my grandmother was a Nazi. The words sat like a bruise on the page. The next morning, her email inbox held a reply from the archive. A final set of documents she'd requested days earlier, among them a letter dated 1946 from US Consulate, Bern, to Eleanor Thompson. Subject line, approval for identity reassignment, immediate destruction of prior documentation advised. Claire stared at it, hand trembling. It was no longer a theory, no longer a possibility. It was fact, signed, stamped, delivered across generations. The truth had never been lost. It had been buried. The care home stood quietly at the edge of a suburban neighborhood, nestled among maple trees that had already begun to turn gold. There was a stillness to the place, the kind that wrapped around everything. Soft voices, slow footsteps, and the scent of lavender hanging faintly in the air. Claire hadn't visited in months, not because she didn't care, but because something inside her had been waiting for the right moment, for confirmation, for courage. She found Eleanor on the porch, seated in her usual chair, flipping through a faded German recipe book. Her hands, now slender and marked with time, moved over the pages without urgency, as though each one held more memory than instruction. When she saw Claire, her eyes lit up. The smile was real, but small, almost cautious. Claire approached slowly, said she missed her, said her research trip was over, that she wanted to see her. Eleanor's gaze shifted slightly. She nodded, but something in her posture tightened. She asked about the trip. Claire answered carefully, spoke of the archives, of old documents, of photos, particularly one, a woman from 1943, strikingly familiar. Eleanor turned a page in her book slowly. Her hands didn't shake, but her silence said enough. Claire didn't press. She simply let the silence stretch, carefully placing her words like stones across a river. Eventually, she asked if Eleanor remembered anyone named Anna Weissman, and that was when the page stopped turning. A breath, a pause. "No," Eleanor said, calm, too calm. "Why do you ask?" Claire shrugged. "Just a name that kept reappearing. Nothing important." Then came the real question, posed gently, without accusation. "Do you still keep the old family photos?" Eleanor hesitated. Her eyes, once so sharp, blinked slowly. "They're in the jewelry box, third drawer in the bedroom." She paused. "They're old, not much worth looking at." Claire nodded, but something in her stomach turned cold. She walked the hallway to the bedroom, like someone approaching a locked door that had been left open just for them. The drawer opened with a soft creak. Inside the jewelry box were tangled necklaces, yellowed photographs, and at the very bottom a sealed envelope. German stamps, thick paper, folded with care. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, and she knew. She hadn't come looking for ghosts, but she had found one. The envelope weighed almost nothing, and yet, in Claire's hands, it felt impossibly heavy, as if it carried more than paper, as if it held the gravity of memory, denial, and something far more dangerous: truth. She sat on the edge of the bed, sunlight filtering softly through the sheer curtains. Everything in the room was quiet, undisturbed, the kind of stillness that belongs to old places and older secrets. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside were three things: a brittle passport, two folded documents, and a black and white photograph. Claire looked at the photo first. It showed a young woman, no more than 20, standing near a train platform, wearing a pale dress and a scarf tied at the nape of her neck. Her posture was confident, almost defiant. Her eyes looked just off to the side, as if refusing to meet the camera. There was no caption, but Claire didn't need one. She knew that face, older, hardened, softer perhaps in memory. But it was the same. It was Eleanor, or rather Anna. She opened the first document. It was a name change request, dated January 1946. Anna Weissman requesting to become Eleanor Thompson. Reason: resettlement. Status: approved. Claire's throat tightened. The second document was colder, a memorandum from the US consulate. The instructions were clear: destroy. All prior identification. Maintain complete discretion. Her eyes stung. Finally, she unfolded the passport. The image was formal. The same woman, a few months older, her hair shorter, her face thinner, the name stamped below: Eleanor Thompson. Claire pressed her thumb against the edge of the photo, as if she might feel something through the paper. Heat, regret, a voice. From the past, there was none, only a silence so profound it felt like a second presence in the room. She placed the documents gently back into the envelope, not to hide them, but to protect them, not for denial, but for reckoning. And when she walked back into the hallway, envelope in hand, Eleanor had not moved. She still sat with the recipe book open on her lap, but her hands no longer turned the pages. Claire didn't speak. She didn't need to. And Eleanor didn't look surprised, as if somehow she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. The envelope now lay between them on the table like a quiet verdict. The care home's porch was wrapped in early dusk, its edges dipped in gold and long shadows. A breeze moved through the trees, soft and steady, but everything around Claire and Eleanor felt perfectly still, like the pause before a confession. Eleanor looked at the envelope. She didn't reach for it. She simply breathed, deeply, wearily. "I always knew you'd find it," she said at last, her voice quieter than Claire had ever heard it. Claire didn't respond. There was nothing left to ask. She waited. Eleanor's hands, thin and delicate, folded together on her lap. She stared out toward the fading light. "My name was Anna Weissman," she said slowly, as if pulling the words from someplace buried deep. "I was 19 when they came to recruit me." The words sat heavy between them. Claire remained still. They said I was useful. I spoke French, English. I could translate, write, organize. It was a way to serve the country. Or that's what I was told. Her voice didn't tremble, but something in her eyes did. At first, I believed I was doing something good. I wasn't hurting anyone. I wasn't at the front. I was behind a desk. That's what I told myself. She paused, then laughed, dry and bitter. But desks can kill too. Paper, words, ideas, they all do damage. Claire felt her throat tighten. Eleanor turned her gaze to her. "I never carried a weapon. I never raised a hand to anyone, but I was a part of it. I worked for them. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want the answers." Her voice faltered then, just for a moment. "When the war ended, I ran, like many others. Someone told me I could start over, that if I changed my name and helped the Americans, I could disappear. Be someone new," Claire whispered. "And did." You, Eleanor, looked at her with eyes clouded by memory, and something else, regret. "No," she said. "I didn't disappear. I just hid. For decades." The porch fell silent again. Claire didn't move. She felt the weight of it all pressing into her, not just the facts, but the space they occupied. The gap between the woman who raised her and the girl who had once sat behind that desk in Berlin. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. Her voice was barely a breath now. "I have lived every day with that silence, not because I was afraid of being found, but because I didn't know if I could bear the way you'd look at me once you knew." She looked down. "I was young. I was scared. I didn't understand what I was a part of until it was too late. And when I did, I was already someone else." She lifted her gaze once more. "I am sorry, Claire, not just for what I did, but for not telling you." The envelope still sat between them, but now it felt lighter, because the silence was no longer holding the truth hostage. It had finally begun to speak. The days that followed passed quietly. There were no more questions, no more hidden boxes, no sudden tears or dramatic scenes, just silence, the kind that no longer suffocates but breathes, the kind that stays in a room not because something was left unsaid, but because at last everything had been spoken. Claire didn't return the envelope to the drawer. She didn't burn it. She kept it in her bag, folded with care, like something sacred, not because she forgave, not because she judged, but because she understood that truth, once revealed, doesn't ask to be erased. It asks to be carried, gently, honestly. Her thesis changed. She rewrote entire chapters. Not about Eleanor. She kept the names hidden, blurred in a layer of anonymity. But the story, the reality, the emotional core that remained. In every line, every reference, every piece of evidence, there was something deeper now, something lived. At her defense, her professors listened in silence. When she finished, there were no questions, only a pause, and then a nod. Weeks later, she visited Eleanor for the last time. The old woman sat by the window, a blanket over her knees, eyes soft with fading clarity. Claire sat beside her. They didn't speak. The truth no longer needed words. When Eleanor passed, Claire didn't cry. Not then. It was only later, at the cemetery, standing in the cold morning light, the envelope in one hand and an old photograph in the other, that the tears came. She placed the photo on the grave, whispered something she'd been holding in her chest for days. "Now the truth is safe, you can rest." And as the wind stirred the leaves around her, Claire felt no anger, no shame, only the quiet strength of someone who had looked into the past and survived it. If this story moved you, Don't leave in silence. Like this video if you believe some truths deserve to be told, no matter how long they've been buried. Comment below. What would you do if you were in Claire's place? Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional stories that stay with you long after they end. And above all, share this video, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. Thank you for being here. New stories every week, and each one brings a piece of the past back to life.